Thank you very much, and thanks to Stan for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be able to chat with you folks today. And so I'm talking about fiber, dietary fiber, trying to make it interesting. I know when people think of fiber, they think of eating kind of a bowl of, bark, or they think about like healthy stool function, so it's not very glamorous, but by the time I finish, I hope fiber increases in your importance level in terms of nutrients. Here are my disclosures, which don't affect this talk. And so what I want to be able to have all of us do by the end of this talk is to define dietary fiber, to highlight the benefits of an enriched fiber diet, to understand the recommended fiber intake, and then where can we go and identify foods that can supply a good source of fiber. So let's start with what is dietary fiber. And unfortunately, the definition is very difficult to do because there is no one well understood and accepted definition of dietary fiber, and that's because fiber is many things with many different chemical and physiologic properties. In the past, it was known as just roughage and bulk, and it was traditionally the portions of the plant that was not digested by us humans, but I'm sorry to have missed Dr. Walker's talk. I'm sure he might have mentioned that we have other organisms that we're carrying with us that can metabolize fiber. So to make things as simple as possible, both for me and for you, with all of the different definitions that are out there, I've decided to focus you on the definition by the Institute of Medicine, which comes from the National Academies of Science, because this definition, which came out in about 2001, as you look at the literature and you look at other committees and at different government sites, it seems that this is the definition of fiber that is being agreed upon. And the Institute of Medicine, like I said, came up with this, and it looks like, unfortunately, none of my references are showing up for you folks here, but they will be on the handouts later on that you will have at your disposal. This was a study group that was put together by the IOM specifically to come up with a definition of fiber. So this is their definition. Dietary fiber, naturally occurring, it should be edible. It's typically non-digestible, carbohydrates or lignin, which is the part of the plant that gives it the wood or the bark component. And then functional or added fibers, and these are fibers that either you isolate them, you can extract them from food sources, or you can make them synthetically in a lab, and that the ones that they're talking about here provide specific health benefits. So total fiber is the combination of dietary fiber plus this functional or added fiber. Now the FDA in 2016 made some changes or decided to start making changes to the nutrition facts labels that we all see in many of our products at the grocery store. And I'm bringing this up here. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on in my talk. But it's because the FDA, for the first time, did one thing, and that was actually write down a definition of fiber, which hadn't been written down before. And they decided to choose a definition that really is very similar. It's the same as that of the IOM. So and the other thing that the FDA decided to do was to make a focus as fiber being a food that has health benefits. So here's their definition, again, non-digestible. They use the word soluble and insoluble because many times you'll see that on the foods. That's just based on some chemical parameters with some fiber. They also mention the isolated, synthetic, non-digestible carbohydrates. And just to give you an example of what the FDA kind of definitions mean, so the natural occurring fibers, we can both kind of pick that up. It's the whole grains, it's the fruits, it's the vegetables. Some naturally processed fibers are those that are just some mildly processed, but they may end up as cereal bran or vegetable or protein extracts. But then I want to show you this list here towards the right called the isolated or synthetic fibers. The FDA decided that they would choose 7 fibers to be those that are considered in their in list, the list that are going to be those added fibers that are going to have health benefits. And here they are. And I think this has actually caused some changes in the fibers that are being used in some infant formulas and in other foods. As you can see, there are many other functional fibers that are under review by the FDA, and there's been a lot of comment back and forth during their comment period for this. In particular, there was a lot of discussion about inulin and fructooligosaccharidases that many people thought should be in the IN list, but they have been kicked out of that IN list. So this is for your information in terms of what's going on with the FDA. So many talks could be given on the benefits of a high-fiber diet, and I've decided just to basically summarize some of the information here for you. In general, most of the discussions for fiber, kind of maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, really had to do with fiber and its laxation capabilities, or its abilities to promote regularity in your bowel movements. So some fibers will increase the weight and the size of your stool and soften the stool consistency. But then later on, kind of in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, more work has been done. It's typically population-based studies that have shown us that fiber has been associated with reduced risks of certain chronic diseases. Very importantly, coronary heart disease, which is the kind of #1 killer really in the United States, and its effects are thought to be due because fiber has been associated with lower cholesterol levels, decreasing the bad cholesterol, the LDL, reducing hypertension, and also reducing inflammation from its effects on short-chain fatty acid. It's also been associated with reduced diabetes. Some mechanisms have been because it slows down the absorption of some sugars, and it improves blood glucose levels. And then reducing the risk of obesity, aiding in weight loss, increasing satiety. And then, although a little bit controversial, in reducing the risk of colorectal cancer. In some ways, fiber has been shown to enhance apoptosis, so the death of cells, and decreasing the proliferation of cancer-related cells. The studies here are felt to be not as strong as for some of these other conditions, but the Cancer Association feels that there's enough there, and certainly when you combine it with all the other health benefits of fiber, that they promote a high-fiber diet for the prevention of colorectal cancer. So this is from a review from 2009. Again, I'm sorry you're not seeing the references, that looked at many different studies on fiber, and so I'm putting this table here so that you can actually see some of the actual data that's out there. This is kind of an analysis of many seminal studies that have been done. For example, for coronary heart disease, the 7 studies that are shown in this particular manuscript had more than 150,000 patients, and it showed that the relative risk of fiber was reduced by 29% when you compared people that ate high-fiber diets to people that ate low-fiber diets. And you can see similarities in terms of decreased risk for stroke, diabetes, and obesity. More recently, this is data from a 2013 study that looked at more recent studies, and the difference for this meta-analysis is that they were able to generate dose-response curves in terms of how much fiber you ate. Most of the other studies were you either ate high fiber or low fiber, and that's really how things were looked at. This group was able to show that for coronary heart disease and for vascular disease, for every 7 grams per day of fiber, it seemed to reduce the risk of the first event of these diseases by 9%, which was felt to be a significant value in these types of population studies. Now, as you can imagine, for kids, there's really there's no studies per se for kids in terms of diabetes or for heart disease, but in most of the studies that there are in children are looking at adiposity and the effects of fiber. And this is a study from 2016 in the Nutrition Journal that divided children in 3 different groups, and it was based on how much whole grain they consumed. And the whole grain was in ounce equivalents, which is often how this is measured. 16 grams of whole grain per an ounce equivalent. And it divided the children into 3 groups based on their whole grain consumption, with certain numbers, a large proportion of them not eating any, some 0 to 1, and the others greater than 1. And then they looked at BMI, waist circumference, the percentage that were either in the overweight or obese category, and then the children that were obese. And what they showed across the line, and these were statistically significant changes that were noticed, is that BMI was decreased, weight circumference, and all these other markers of adiposity, the more whole grains that children ate. So this is a study that provides you with some information, but it was just published a couple of years ago in 2016. And then this is from a study that was done in Danish children, just published last year in 2017. And again, they were looking at whole grain consumption because that's something that's relatively easy to do in children. And in this particular case, they actually associated it to a protective cardiometabolic profile in children. So whole grain oats was associated with lower serum insulin, fat mass index, blood pressure, LDL, and cholesterol in this child population between 8 and 11 years of age. And interestingly, their improvement in these cardiometabolic measures was independent of body fatness in the child, so that it showed that even for children who may be in that overweight or obese category, that just by adding fiber to their diet, it could actually potentially decrease their risk of cardiovascular events without necessarily decreasing their weight substantially. So why does fiber work? Well, before, a lot of the thoughts had to do with it would fill you up, you not eat as much fiber, those kinds of things. I think now, like everything else, the microbiome is where it's at, and I know Dr. Walker talked a lot about that this morning, but this is just to highlight a few things in terms of fiber specifically, but this is a lay article from the New York Times. It was just published in January. And it talked about why fiber is good for you. And it highlighted a couple of studies, including this study from folks at the University of Georgia, I think they were. And this was a study in which they used mice, because you can manipulate mice better than humans. But they basically gave mice, low fiber diet, high fat, low fiber diet, and these mice ended up developing more or less a metabolic syndrome. The mice ended up having a thinning of their intestinal walls, a thinning of their mucus layer, and more of the bacteria that was in their intestines was able to approximate closer to their intestinal wall, and so they were able to develop chronic inflammation. But when they added inulin as a source of fiber, they noticed that inulin was protective for these mice, and that the inulin, they felt it had to do with a mechanism through the inflammatory pathway. It happens to be the IL-22 pathway, and they also noticed many changes in the microbiome of these mice, with the microbiome becoming very, very reduced and not robust. In humans, of course, it's a little bit harder to do, but this is a study in which they decided to give almonds as the source of fiber. And they basically did it 4 or 5 different times, gave people their food in a metabolic type of a unit, and added either whole almonds or ground up almonds or almond butter. And what they noticed was with the whole almonds or the ground up almonds, that the individuals had significant changes in their microbiome. And in general, a lot of the organisms that produce short-chain fatty acids were increased in these individuals. And short-chain fatty acids can loop and decrease inflammation. The almond butter was the same as the control. So although almond butter can be a source of energy and calories, in this particular case it appears to be way too processed to have really had an effect on the microbiome. All right, so how much fiber should we all be eating? So again, I'm going to turn to the IOM for their recommendations, because this is now, again, what's taking a bit of hold more in the United States, and these recommendations came from 2002. In general, what the IOM has done has been to connect the amount of fiber that you should be eating with the amount of energy that you're consuming. And so if there's only one number that you remember out of my whole talk, it's really this one. 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories. And so if based on a recommended 2,000 calories for women, that would be 28 grams, 2,500 calories a day for men, that would be 35 grams. So if you hear the numbers 28 and 35, that's where these come from. For children, things have been a little bit more unclear because of the lack of data in children. And the first reference here, the AI levels here on your right, are actually the same values, the 14 grams per 1,000 calories, but they've adjusted them here based on the amount, the caloric intake that you would recommend to a child. But there are other foundations like American Health Foundation, which is the age plus 5 that a lot of people use because it's easy to remember, or the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is 0.5 grams per kilogram. But the age plus 5 has been used quite a bit. But if you look across the line, just if you look at the 1 to 3 age range, you see what a variety, what a large variability there is depending on which one of these groups you decide to use as your data source. What I recommend, and again, what the FDA has also been using, is to go and back to this. 14 grams per 1,000 calories. Keep that in your mind, and of course it depends on the caloric intake of the child. But if you want to go back to a particular number, that's the number, I think, moving forward that we're going to be going to. So this comes from the USDA website, What We Eat in America, which is based on the NHANES data from 2009 to 2010. And I just finished saying that it's 14 grams per 1,000 calories, 28 grams for men, 35 grams for women. And as you can see, we're not doing a very good job here in our U.S. population. The median dietary fiber intake is 16 grams per day. So that's about 50% or so in terms of what we should be eating. The blue is males, the green is females. The males they do have increased fiber intake, but really it's because the males are consuming more energy. So when you look in terms of fiber density, women actually are eating more fiber-dense meals than males, but they're just not consuming as many calories as males are. And unfortunately for many of the patients that we deal with and with their families and in the adult population, the consumption of fiber is correlated to income, with individuals that are in the lowest income brackets also consuming the least amount of fiber. Now, Kathleen showed this to you folks. This comes from the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, the 2015 to 2020 study. And just to remind you what she had mentioned there, the 0 in the center line is basically where we should be. That's our goal. Orange is bad. That means we're overeating or undereating things. And I just want to focus you on the categories there that say vegetables, fruit, and total grains, which are the sources of good sources of fiber. And as you see that we in the United States are not quite up to par in where we should be in consuming these types of products. And whole grains, which are certainly a source in the United States where many people can get their fiber, we're not doing very well at either. So the blue bars here are the recommended intake for whole grains and for refined grains. It represents kind of 50%. And we should be, or the recommendations are, 50% refined, 50% whole grains. And what's happening here is you see in the green, that's the whole grain consumption, and the orange is the refined grain consumption. So we're that far apart in terms of the type of grains that we're eating. So the fine grain are, as I'm sure everybody in the room knows, the white flours, the white rice. That's where many of our food products are coming from. So what are the best fiber food choices? Again, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, beans, peas, and legumes, and then nuts and seeds. I'm listing for you here, obviously it's just a very short list, but it's common high fiber foods, with foods that are felt to be a good source of fiber to have about 3 grams per serving. So that's why I'm giving you kind of some options here, from those lentils being kind of the best source of of one of the great sources of fiber and on down. And for us and for our patients, it's good to give them some visible tools. And again, this is from my plate. And a one-liner that you can just tell them is, half of your plate from fruits and vegetables and half of your grains should be whole grains, which is what's represented here. Tips for us and to tell our patients to add fiber to their diet include the addition of high fiber breakfast cereals. And Kathleen actually mentioned that, with a cereal and adding some components to it, you can get a nutritionally dense meal. So high fiber breakfast cereals are a great way. Switching to whole grains, so the whole grain breads, for example. Substituting whole grain flour, if you can do that, at least in part, with your baked goods. And of course, again, eating more legumes, fruits, vegetables, and eating high fiber snacks, which include things like popcorn and whole grain crackers and that sort of thing. So I'm bringing this up again just because I just want to remind you of what I told you about those isolated or synthetic fibers, that now things can only be in that group of 7. And this is how it'll affect things. So the FDA, if you go to the supermarket now and you start looking at the nutrition facts labels, you'll see that some have changed and some haven't. Now it's probably until 2020 or 2021 where all companies have to change to these new labels. But this is how it affects how fiber is going to be viewed. So in the previous calculation, which is on the right here, you had a product, an oatmeal bar, that had 15 grams of total dietary fiber. Where did that come from? 10 grams came from oats and inulin, and 5 grams came from cellulose. So now this is the post-2016, the new calculation. All of a sudden, that fiber bar has gone from 15 grams of total fiber to 10. And the reason is as follows. So you have 5 grams from the oats, you have 5 grams from the cellulose, but the inulin is no longer considered a beneficial fiber. So that's been removed from the fiber count, and that leaves to 10 grams. The inulin will still be counted at the carbs, but no longer in the fiber arena. And that's because the FDA wants to show that the fiber that you're eating is considered the beneficial fiber. So that's a new change. And it looks like, and so a couple of things, it looks like a few slides have just been removed as well. But so another thing that I want to tell you is how this will also change the labels that you view is that for some foods that were branded as having a good source of fiber or being high in fiber, some of those manufacturers might need to take that off of their branding, because the other change that the FDA made was to go from 25 grams per day of fiber being routine now to 28, so 14 grams times 2,000 calorie diet. And what that's done is that in some products the percent of the daily value of fiber may drop because you're now looking at a higher total fiber intake. That drop might cause, for example, some products to fall below the 10% mark, so they can no longer be called a good source of fiber product. So that might change some of the things that we see. All right, what about fiber supplements? Well, what we need to keep in mind is that there's the whole foods are the best source of fiber because they provide a variety of different types of fiber. And this is not provided by the fiber supplements. You don't get the same variety, the same vitamins, and the same minerals. So just telling somebody to add or sprinkle some fiber onto their diet is probably not going to be giving them the health benefits that you can with eating whole foods. So key points that I want you to take away, hopefully today, is the knowledge that there is a lot of medical evidence that high fiber intake has been associated with a reduced risk of chronic diseases, and chronic diseases that are obviously very important in our U.S. population. That the IOM recommendation of fiber intake is 14 grams per 1,000 calories. That the new FDA nutrient facts labels are focusing on the health benefits of fiber. and that dietary fiber, unfortunately, still remains a nutrient of concern in the United States because we're only consuming as a population about half the amount of fiber that we should be consuming. And the best food options continue to be vegetables, fruits, beans, and whole grains. And I'll leave you with a photo of our new buildings at Hopkins and the Inner Harbor at Baltimore, if any of you want to come up and visit. So thank you very much.